Crystal light spilled across the marble floor of the Grand Hotel ballroom, and the autumn rain outside tapped softly against the tall windows facing the boulevard. Nathan Holloway straightened his tie one last time, then turned to look at his wife with a coldness that made the air between them feel colder than the weather outside. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "You shouldn't come inside," he said, as if he were commenting on the weather, rather than ending something between them that had taken years to build. He told her the gala was only for people who deserved to be there, and that her presence would embarrass him in front of the board members he had spent months courting. Amara Ellison said nothing at first. She simply smiled, the kind of smile that revealed nothing at all, and turned to walk away into the misty parking drive outside the hotel entrance. But before she could take a second step, the private elevator doors slid open behind them with a soft chime that seemed to cut through the noise of the crowd. Every head in the hall turned. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence. The most powerful man in the entire corporation walked straight toward her, arms already opening, and pulled her into an embrace in front of hundreds of frozen guests, none of whom understood what they were witnessing unfold before their eyes. 6 months earlier, nobody would have predicted this moment would ever arrive. Amara and Nathan had built a life together that looked, from the outside, like the kind of marriage people admired at dinner parties and quoted at anniversaries. She held a doctorate in strategic management, the kind of degree that opened doors most people never even saw open in front of them. She had been the quiet architect behind decisions that made Nathan look brilliant in boardrooms, though few people ever traced the ideas back to her patient, careful mind working late into the night. For years, she had stepped back from her own career so that his could rise, packing boxes for one relocation after another, rewriting his presentations at midnight, calming his nerves before quarterly reviews when his hands shook too much to hold his own notes steady. Nathan, in turn, had once called her his secret weapon. He used to say it proudly, in front of colleagues, as though sharing a rare and valuable treasure with the world around him. But success has a way of changing men slowly. The way water changes stone over years, nobody notices passing until the shape is already gone, and Nathan began to believe the polish surrounding him was entirely his own creation from the start. By the time he became regional vice president, something in him had shifted completely, quietly, the way a house settles before anyone notices the cracks spreading along the walls. He stopped introducing Amara at company dinners, letting her sit quietly at the far end of the table while he worked the room alone. He stopped mentioning her name in conversations about his rise through the ranks of the company. When friends asked about her, he would say she was busy or tired, or simply not interested in networking events anymore, offering the same tired excuse each time. The truth was quieter and crueler than any excuse he offered anyone. He had started to see her as something that belonged in the background of his life, not on its stage beside him, where she once stood. He would tell her, almost gently, almost like advice given for her own good, that she no longer fit into the world he was building for himself and his career. He never explained what that meant exactly. He never needed to explain. Amara absorbed each comment, the way she absorbed everything, with a stillness that unsettled people who expected her to fight back, or cry, or beg him to explain himself further. She remembered, though she rarely spoke of it anymore to anyone, the early years when Nathan used to ask her opinion on every decision before signing his name to anything important. She remembered late nights at their small first apartment, coffee going cold between them on the kitchen table, notebooks filled with numbers and strategies that would later become the foundation of his entire reputation in the industry. She remembered how he used to look at her across a room full of strangers, searching for her approval before anyone else's opinion mattered to him. That man seemed to exist now only in memory, replaced gradually by someone who measured his worth entirely by what other people thought of him rather than what was true. Friends who had known them both in the earlier years sometimes asked her, carefully, whether she was happy, and she always answered with the same practiced calm, the kind of answer that closed a conversation, rather than opening one further. There had been a dinner party earlier that same year, hosted by one of Nathan's colleagues in a house far grander than their own, where the cruelty of his transformation had shown itself clearly for the first time in front of witnesses who noticed but said nothing. A guest had asked Amara about her doctorate, curious about her research, and for a moment the old spark returned to her voice as she began explaining her work on organizational recovery strategies. Nathan had interrupted before she finished 2 full sentences, steering the conversation smoothly toward his own quarterly results instead, laughing lightly as though her academic background were merely a charming anecdote rather than the foundation of everything he had built his entire career upon. Amara had smiled and let the subject drop, the way she always did in these situations, though something in her eyes had gone quiet and distant for the remainder of the evening that followed. Driving home that night through empty streets, Nathan had complained that she seemed too serious around his colleagues, too eager to talk about theory instead of results, and Amara had simply looked out the window at the passing streetlights without answering him at all that night. The gala marking 40 years since the founding of the corporation was approaching quickly, and Nathan had spoken of nothing else for weeks on end. He called it the most important night of his entire career, the night the board would finally decide whether he would be named Chief Executive Officer of the entire region under his leadership. Melissa Grant, the marketing director, had helped him rehearse his remarks twice, standing in his office with a stopwatch while he practiced his tone in front of the mirrored wall behind his desk. Owen Barrett, the head of human resources, had quietly hinted over lunch one afternoon that the promotion was as good as confirmed already, pending only the formality of the evening's presentation to the shareholders. Nathan wanted nothing, absolutely nothing, to disturb the image he had spent years constructing brick by careful brick in front of the people who mattered most to his ambitions. So one evening, over a dinner neither of them finished, he told Amara plainly that she should stay home that night rather than accompany him. She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded, the way she always did, without argument, without tears, without the fight he perhaps expected, but never once received from her. It was the kind of silence that should have worried him more than it did that evening. On the afternoon of the gala, as Nathan adjusted his cufflinks in front of the bedroom mirror, he said the words that would echo through the ballroom before the night was over completely. "You'll embarrass me," he told her, not cruelly, but matter-of-factly, the way a man states a fact he has never once bothered to question in his own mind. Amara did not answer him at all. She simply watched him leave the house first, listen to his car, pull away down the wet street until the sound faded completely into the distance, and sat alone for a while in the quiet house that had once felt like theirs together, years earlier. Somewhere behind her calm expression, a memory stirred quietly, one that Nathan had never known existed, one that had nothing at all to do with him or their marriage. 20 years earlier, long before Nathan Holloway had ever heard her name mentioned by anyone in his circle, Amara had been a brilliant young doctoral researcher attending an industry conference in a city she barely remembered clearly now, after so much time had passed. She had gone there to present a paper on organizational recovery strategies, expecting nothing more than polite applause from academics who would forget her by the following morning at breakfast. Instead, she met a tired, graying man sitting alone at the back of the room, listening more intently than anyone else in the audience that day. His name was Theodore Ashcroft, and at the time, his company stood on the very edge of collapse, weeks away from bankruptcy filings nobody outside his closest circle knew about. Nobody in that conference room knew how close the corporation truly was to disappearing entirely within months of that gathering. Nobody except Theodore himself, and soon after, Amara as well, once he found the courage to ask for her help directly. He had approached her quietly after her presentation ended, waiting until the crowd around her thinned, and asked if she might be willing to look at a set of numbers. He could not make sense of himself, despite years of experience running the company. She agreed out of curiosity more than anything else, expecting to spend perhaps an hour reviewing spreadsheets before returning to her own research. Instead, she found herself staying awake past midnight in a borrowed conference room, pages spread across the table, watching patterns emerge that nobody else at the company had noticed or dared to point out to a chairman, already under enormous pressure from his own investors. What she discovered troubled her deeply. 3 separate divisions were quietly bleeding money in ways the internal reports had disguised through creative accounting that nobody had thought to question. A supplier contract renewed automatically each year contained terms that had grown wildly unfavorable over time without anyone reviewing them properly. She laid it all out for Theodore plainly, without softening the truth, and watched him absorb the weight of it without flinching once. He thanked her simply, then asked what she would do in his position if the company were hers to save. She answered without hesitation, and from that single conversation, an entire recovery strategy slowly began to take shape between them over the following weeks. Over the following weeks, without pay, without recognition, and without anyone else's knowledge at all, Amara spent her nights building a strategic framework that would later become the foundation of the company's entire survival going forward. She analyzed failing supply chains until dawn broke quietly over her small apartment window each morning. She rewrote financial models that veteran consultants had already abandoned as hopeless causes not worth pursuing any further with their limited time. Theodore read every page she sent him personally, often staying awake through the night himself, just to respond with questions by morning. Something in her clarity, her discipline, her refusal to flatter him with false optimism when the numbers said otherwise, moved him in a way few people ever had across his long career in business. He began to think of her not as a consultant, but as something closer to family. The daughter he had never had time to raise properly during decades, spent building an empire from absolutely nothing but ambition and grit. Over the years that followed their first meeting, he offered her leadership positions more than once, each time with the quiet hope that she would finally accept a permanent place at his side within the company he had rebuilt because of her work. Each time she declined politely, choosing instead a quieter life, one where her brilliance stayed hidden behind someone else's name and someone else's ambitions rather than her own. She told him once, over coffee in his private office on a gray afternoon, that she preferred building things rather than being seen building them in public. Theodore never fully understood her reasoning, though he respected it enough never to push too hard against her wishes. He simply made certain, in quiet ways she rarely noticed, that a door always remained open for her whenever she was ready to walk through it herself. There had been one particular winter, years after the company's recovery was complete, when Theodore had fallen seriously ill and spent nearly a month in a hospital bed with only a handful of visitors allowed each day. Amara had come every single afternoon without fail, sitting quietly beside him, reading aloud from business journals he could no longer hold steady in his own hands. She never once mentioned it to Nathan, never sought sympathy or recognition for the hours she spent in that quiet hospital room. Theodore recovered slowly, and though he never spoke of those weeks publicly, he carried the memory of her loyalty with him every day afterward, long before the Gala gave him the opportunity to finally return even a fraction of it. Anyone watching Amara Ellison closely enough over the years might have realized she was never quite as ordinary as she allowed the world around her to believe about her life. The night of the Gala arrived, wrapped in a fine autumn mist, the kind that clings to expensive coats and blurs the edges of streetlights along the boulevard leading to the hotel. The hotel itself, a 7-star establishment known for hosting royalty and heads of state over the decades, glowed against the darkened sky, like something pulled from an old photograph nobody had seen in years. Executives stepped out of black cars in tailored suits, pressed to absolute perfection for the occasion. Investors arrived with practiced smiles, already fixed carefully in place before the cameras even found them waiting near the entrance. Reporters gathered near the grand entrance, cameras angled toward the red carpet, where the corporation's leadership would make their traditional entrance for the evening ahead. Nathan stepped out first, alone, adjusting his jacket with the confidence of a man who believed the entire night already belonged to him completely and without question. Melissa approached him near the entrance, scanning the crowd behind him with a practiced eye trained over years of similar events. "Where's your wife tonight?" she asked, the question casual, the kind people ask without expecting complications to follow it. Nathan let out a small, dismissive laugh that carried further across the lobby than he intended it to. "She doesn't really fit this crowd," he said, loud enough for a few nearby colleagues to hear clearly from where they stood. A ripple of soft laughter followed his comment, the kind of laughter that costs nothing and means everything to the person who provoked it for their own amusement. Nobody noticed Amara arriving several minutes later, stepping out of a taxi in a simple, elegant dress, the mist settling gently on her shoulders as she approached the grand entrance completely alone and unannounced. Security stopped her politely at the door, checking a tablet twice before speaking. Her name was not on the guest list, they explained, their tone apologetic, but entirely firm about following the rules set for the evening. Nathan, standing only a few feet away with Melissa and two board members deep in conversation about the quarters numbers, glanced toward the small commotion and said absolutely nothing at all to help her through the checkpoint. When a security officer asked if he perhaps knew the woman causing the brief delay at the entrance, Nathan looked directly at Amara and answered without a single moment of hesitation in his voice. "I didn't invite her," he said flatly, turning his attention back to Melissa, as though the matter were already settled. The words landed like a heavy door closing somewhere far away, final and absolute. Amara studied his face for a long moment, searching for some flicker of hesitation, some trace of the man she had once known intimately for so many years. She found absolutely none in his expression. She turned quietly, gathering her coat around her shoulders, prepared to walk back into the misty night, without another single word spoken between them at all. The rain had picked up slightly outside, tapping against the awning above the entrance, and for a brief moment she simply stood there, watching the wet pavement reflect the golden light spilling from the lobby windows behind her. She had known, somewhere quiet inside herself, that this moment might come eventually, though knowing it in advance did nothing to soften the sting of hearing it spoken aloud in front of strangers. She thought briefly of turning back to say something, some final word to mark the ending of whatever remained between them, but decided against it, understanding that some endings need no ceremony at all to become real. At that exact moment, the private VIP elevator chimed softly at the far end of the marble lobby, drawing a few curious glances from nearby guests. The doors slid open, and Theodore Ashcroft stepped out, 72 years old, silver-haired, carrying himself with the quiet authority of a man who had built an entire empire from nothing but instinct and persistence over 5 decades. He paused only a second before his eyes found her across the crowded, glittering room. "Amara," he called out, his voice carrying across the marble lobby with a warmth that startled everyone standing within earshot of the moment. He crossed the distance quickly, ignoring the stunned board members frozen mid-conversation beside him near the entrance, and wrapped her in an embrace that seemed to erase 20 years in a single, unhurried instant shared between them. The entire lobby fell into a silence so complete that the soft classical music drifting from inside the ballroom suddenly seemed far too loud for the weight of the moment. Nathan stood frozen near the entrance, his champagne glass forgotten in his hand, watching the scene unfold as though it belonged to someone else's life, entirely, rather than his own. The board members exchanged confused glances among themselves, none of them able to make sense of what they were witnessing unfold directly in front of them. Theodore pulled back slightly, holding Amara by the shoulders, studying her face with something close to genuine relief after so much time apart. "You finally came," he said softly, his voice thick with an emotion few people had ever heard from him in public settings before this particular evening. Nathan's mind raced desperately, searching for an explanation that made sense of any of what he was seeing, but finding nothing except a growing, sickening certainty that something in his understanding of his own marriage had been catastrophically, fundamentally wrong for a very long time. Theodore did not wait for introductions or explanations from anyone standing nearby. He simply took Amara's arm and guided her toward the ballroom entrance, leaving the stunned board members trailing behind them like an afterthought nobody had planned for that evening. Melissa immediately pulled out her phone, typing furiously into the company directory, searching for any record at all of an Amara Ellison connected to the corporation's long and storied history. She found nothing, no employee file, no consulting record, no trace whatsoever in the official archives she had full access to as marketing director. The absence of any information only deepened the mystery swirling steadily through the crowded room around her. Executives who had spent decades climbing the corporate ladder whispered among themselves in small clusters, trying desperately to piece together how a woman none of them recognized could command this kind of reaction from a man who almost never showed emotion in public settings of any kind. Nathan attempted to insert himself into the conversation unfolding near the ballroom entrance, stepping closer to Theodore with a practiced smile plastered carefully across his face, despite the confusion churning beneath it. "Sir, I didn't realize you two were acquainted," he said, his voice strained with forced casualness he could not quite maintain under the circumstances. Theodore barely glanced in his direction at all, his attention entirely fixed on Amara as he asked about her health, her recent years, small personal details about her life that revealed an intimacy Nathan had never known existed between his own wife and the most powerful man in the entire industry they both worked within. For the first time in years, Nathan watched his wife receive the kind of attention and respect typically reserved only for board chairs and major shareholders at these events. And something cold settled slowly, heavily, in the pit of his stomach as he watched. Evelyn Pierce, the evening's master of ceremonies, approached the stage area with visible confusion written across her face, holding a note that had just been handed to her by one of Theodore's assistants moments earlier without explanation. She read it twice before nodding slowly and adjusting the evening's carefully planned program on the spot without further question. The scheduled remarks about quarterly performance and regional expansion would need to wait a little longer than expected by the organizers. Theodore Ashcroft, founder and chairman of the corporation, had requested a moment to address the entire gathering personally, an unusual break from tradition that immediately sent a wave of anticipation rippling through the crowded ballroom, like electricity moving through the room. Theodore climbed the steps to the stage slowly, still holding Amara's hand as though reluctant to let the moment end even briefly before he spoke. He took the microphone and looked out at the sea of expensive suits and glittering jewelry, at 40 years of history represented in that single crowded room before him. "If it weren't for one person," he began, his voice steady, despite his advanced age, and the weight of what he was about to say, "this company would have disappeared from the map 2 decades ago, and none of us would be standing here tonight." A murmur spread through the crowd, curiosity mixing openly with disbelief on dozens of faces at once as guests turned toward one another. He gestured toward the enormous screen behind him, and the room's massive display flickered to life, revealing old documents that had clearly been scanned from paper long since yellowed by the passage of so many years. Strategic frameworks appeared on the screen first, dense with handwritten notes crowding the margins of every page. Internal emails followed next, dated 20 years earlier, discussing recovery plans that historians of the company had always attributed to some anonymous outside consultant nobody could ever quite name or identify. Signatures scrolled slowly across the display, one after another, each one bearing the same name in careful, deliberate handwriting that many in the room now recognized. Amara Ellison. The ballroom erupted into stunned conversation, hundreds of voices rising at once, as executives who had studied the company's history for years suddenly understood they were looking at the true origin of everything they had built their careers upon without ever once knowing it. Before tonight, Nathan stood motionless near the edge of the stage, his face drained of all color, as though the ground beneath him had quietly given way without any warning at all. Every eye in the ballroom slowly turned toward him at once, one after another, until the weight of the room's attention became impossible to escape. The whispers shifted, no longer curious, but distinctly accusatory in tone, as people began connecting details that had never quite added up before tonight's revelation. Several board members recalled strategic documents Nathan had presented over the years during pivotal negotiations, ideas he had claimed as his own breakthrough thinking at the time he presented them. Now, standing beneath the glow of evidence projected 20 feet high above them all, those same documents suddenly bore a completely different signature entirely than the one he had always implied. The applause that had followed Theodore's announcement faded slowly into an uncomfortable, heavy silence, one that settled over Nathan like a verdict, already quietly decided by everyone gathered in that room. The shareholders did not wait long to react to what they had just witnessed unfold on the giant screen. Within minutes, small clusters of investors had gathered near the exits and along the bar, speaking in low, urgent tones about credibility and due diligence going forward into the next fiscal year. They had heard rumors for years about Nathan claiming credit for work that was not entirely his own creation, Quiet rumors passed between assistants and junior analysts who rarely spoke up. But rumors were easy enough to dismiss when a man's confidence never once wavered in front of the people who mattered. Now the rumors had documentation behind them, timestamps, and a signature that predated Nathan's entire career at the company by nearly 2 decades of work. His reputation, built carefully over more than a decade of calculated moves and careful positioning, began to crumble in real time, right there in the middle of a ballroom, filled with the very people whose trust he needed most in the entire world to secure his promotion. A senior board member, a woman named Patricia Coleman, who had sat on the corporation's board for nearly 15 years, approached Theodore quietly near the edge of the room and asked whether the documents on the screen were entirely accurate or whether emotion had perhaps colored his presentation of the evening's events. Theodore assured her calmly that every document had been verified weeks in advance by the company's own legal and archival teams before he ever agreed to display them publicly. He explained that he had waited 20 years to give Amara this recognition properly, and that tonight, with the anniversary gathering already assembled, felt like the only honest moment left to do it. Patricia nodded slowly, satisfied, and turned to relay the confirmation to the other board members still clustered nervously near the bar, watching the unfolding scandal with a mixture of fascination and quiet alarm. Word spread through the executive floor within the hour that his promotion to chief executive officer had been quietly withdrawn from consideration entirely by the board sitting nearby. Owen Barrett, visibly uncomfortable with the conversation, informed him privately near the coat check that the board had authorized an internal investigation into potential misrepresentation of intellectual contributions, along with a broader review of workplace conduct standards. Nathan may have violated over the years, with employees and partners, across several departments. Nathan tried desperately to explain himself to anyone who would still listen to him, insisting there had been some kind of misunderstanding, that credit in corporate environments was always complicated and layered by nature. Nobody wanted to hear any of it from him anymore that night. Over the following weeks, the internal investigation moved forward methodically, interviewing former colleagues and reviewing years of internal memos that painted an increasingly uncomfortable picture of Nathan's rise through the company. 2 junior analysts came forward separately, describing meetings where Nathan had presented recovery frameworks nearly identical to Amara's original documents, without ever mentioning where the ideas had come from originally. A senior director admitted, reluctantly, that he had long suspected something was amiss, but had never felt it was his place to question a rising star with the board's clear favor behind him. By the time the investigation concluded a month later, the findings were forwarded quietly to the full board, along with a recommendation that Nathan's employment be terminated rather than merely demoted, given the pattern of behavior uncovered across multiple years of his tenure. That outcome, however, was still weeks away from being finalized. Amara stood a short distance away throughout the entire unraveling that night, her expression calm, saying absolutely nothing at all, offering no defense and no accusation of her own toward him, simply watching the consequences of many years finally arrive at her husband's feet in front of everyone who mattered to his career. Eventually, Nathan found himself standing before her in a quieter corner of the ballroom, away from the cameras and the whispering crowds still buzzing loudly nearby. His composure was completely gone by this point in the evening. He dropped to one knee, not out of theater, but out of genuine desperation, begging quietly for a private conversation between just the two of them. Amara allowed it, though her face remained entirely unreadable in the dim light of the corner where they stood. Tears streamed down his cheeks as he confessed everything he had buried for years without ever saying it aloud, admitting that ambition had slowly poisoned his judgment over time in ways he only now recognized clearly. He admitted he had convinced himself status mattered more than the person who had helped build every version of success he ever claimed as his own personal achievement. He begged her to reconsider everything between them, to give their marriage one more chance, despite everything that had happened that night, in front of everyone. Amara looked at him for a long moment before speaking at all, her voice quiet but unmistakably final in its tone and delivery. "You didn't lose me in one night," she said. "You lost me one day at a time, for years, and you never noticed because you were too busy looking at everyone but me." A few guests standing nearby, unable to look away from the unfolding scene in front of them, began to applaud softly at her words. The sound spreading gradually through the crowd, like a slow wave of quiet vindication, finally released after so long. Nathan said nothing more after that moment passed between them. There was nothing left worth saying to change what had already happened. Within days, divorce papers arrived at his temporary residence across town, and Amara signed her portion without hesitation or delay, closing a chapter she had clearly been ready to close for far longer than anyone around her had ever realized or understood. Nathan did not fight the formal termination when it finally arrived weeks later by official letter delivered to his temporary residence. He signed the separation papers without argument, aware by then that any further resistance would only invite more scrutiny into a career he preferred people simply forget entirely. He spent the following weeks largely alone, avoiding calls from former colleagues who no longer seemed particularly interested in reaching him anyway, now that his usefulness had ended. In the weeks that followed the gala, Theodore requested a private meeting with Amara at his office, overlooking the entire city skyline from the top floor. He told her plainly, without hesitation, that he wanted her back, not as a hidden consultant, working quietly in anonymous shadows behind someone else's name, but as a permanent, visible member of the organization's highest leadership team going forward into the future. He offered her a position as Global Strategy Board member, a role that would place her decisions directly at the center of the corporation's future direction, no longer buried beneath someone else's name or someone else's credit for her work. Amara sat quietly for a long moment across from him, considering everything the offer represented, everything it would mean to finally step forward after 20 years of choosing to remain unseen by her own design and preference. "You don't have to protect me anymore," she finally said, her voice steady in the quiet office. Theodore shook his head slowly. "I was never protecting you," he answered. "I was waiting for you to decide you were ready, and I think that night finally showed both of us that you already were." He reminded her gently of everything she had built without ever asking for a title, and told her that the company owed her far more than gratitude spoken quietly behind closed doors. He wanted her name on the letterhead, her voice in the strategy meetings, her decisions carrying weight that could no longer be dismissed or overlooked by anyone in the organization. She accepted his offer without further hesitation. For the first time in longer than she could easily remember, Amara chose a path built entirely around her own ambitions, her own voice, her own name attached openly to the work she had always been fully capable of leading herself from the very beginning. When she returned to the ballroom days later for a follow-up announcement made to select board members and senior partners gathered for the occasion, the entire room rose to its feet in applause, a moment that felt less like corporate formality and more like long overdue recognition, finally arriving at its rightful destination after 2 decades of patient waiting. Melissa found herself replaying the evening for weeks afterward, unable to shake the memory of how easily she had laughed along with Nathan's dismissive comment about his own wife earlier that night. She mentioned it once to Owen over coffee in the break room, admitting quietly that she had known Nathan long enough to recognize the pattern now that she was finally looking for it clearly. Owen agreed, adding that the human resources file on Nathan contained more than one anonymous complaint over the years, complaints that had always been quietly resolved before reaching the board's attention. Neither of them said much more about it, though both privately resolved to pay closer attention going forward to the quiet people in the room, the ones who rarely spoke but often knew more than anyone gave them credit for. News of the evening traveled quickly beyond the walls of the hotel itself, reaching business publications and industry newsletters within days of the gala. Analysts who had once praised Nathan's rapid rise now revisited his record with a far more critical eye, questioning which of his celebrated strategies had truly originated with him at all. Meanwhile, profiles began to emerge about Amara Ellison, describing a woman who had quietly shaped outcomes behind the scenes for 2 decades without ever seeking recognition for herself. Colleagues who had barely noticed her presence at company functions over the years suddenly recalled small moments, offhand comments she had made in meetings that had turned out to be remarkably prescient in hindsight. The story of the gala became something people repeated at dinner tables and conferences alike, A cautionary tale about the danger of mistaking visibility for value in any organization. Several months passed quietly after those turbulent weeks, and autumn gave way slowly to a colder, clearer winter season across the region. Amara appeared at an international leadership summit, held in a city far from where her story had first unraveled in front of hundreds of strangers. She was introduced this time not as anyone's wife or hidden advisor, but as the architect behind several major global strategic initiatives now bearing her name publicly for the very first time in her long career. Cameras captured her walking confidently across a stage far larger than the one where everything had first come apart months earlier, delegates from dozens of countries listening intently as she outlined bold visions for the company's next chapter ahead of them all. She spoke without notes, her voice carrying the same calm authority she had always possessed privately, now finally given the platform it had long deserved in front of an audience capable of appreciating it fully. A young analyst in the front row later told a colleague that watching Amara speak felt like watching someone who had clearly been ready for this moment for a very long time, patiently waiting for the world to catch up to what she already understood about herself. Nathan, meanwhile, had quietly stepped away from the corporation entirely, beginning a modest new position at a much smaller firm across town, starting over from a place far humbler than the one he had once occupied so confidently before that night. Backstage, after her summit address concluded to warm applause, Theodore approached her with the same warmth he had shown that rainy autumn night in the hotel lobby months earlier, before everything had changed for both of them. He took her hands gently in his own and told her how proud he was that she had finally stepped into the light after so many years spent hiding her own brilliance behind other people's ambitions and other people's names. Amara smiled at him, a genuine, unguarded smile that reflected none of the caution she had carried for so long throughout her quiet career. "This time," she said softly, meeting his eyes without hesitation, "I'm living for myself." The camera pulled back slowly, capturing her walking forward, with quiet, unmistakable confidence toward the stage ahead of her, applause rising steadily behind her figure, filling the room completely, with the sound of a story finally reaching the ending it had always deserved from the very beginning of everything. Somewhere in that same city, in a modest office far removed from any stage or spotlight, Nathan sat alone, reviewing quarterly numbers for a company that would never carry his name in headlines again. He thought, sometimes, in quiet moments between meetings, about the night everything had unraveled, about the years before it, when he had mistaken silence for weakness, rather than strength patiently waiting for its moment. He never reached out to Amara again after the divorce was finalized, understanding at last that some doors, once closed, are not meant to be reopened by the person who closed them. Amara, for her part, rarely thought of him at all anymore, her attention fully occupied by the work she had waited 2 decades to claim as unmistakably her own. On quiet evenings after long days of meetings and travel, she sometimes sat by her window with a cup of tea, watching the city lights below, and allowed herself a small, private satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge or vindication at all. It was simply the quiet peace of a woman who had finally stopped shrinking herself to fit inside someone else's expectations, choosing instead to stand fully in the space she had always been capable of filling. Theodore often said, whenever a reporter asked him about the corporation's future, that its greatest asset had never been its buildings or its balance sheets, but the people willing to do extraordinary work without ever needing their name on the door to feel it mattered. Amara Ellison, he would add with a faint smile, had simply taken 20 years longer than she should have to let the rest of the world see what he had known about her all along, and he considered himself fortunate to have been the one standing beside her the night she finally chose to let them see it.